Evening of May 31st, 2009, Air France Flight 447 departed Rio, bound for Paris. The aircraft was an Airbus A330-203, and this flight had 228 people on board, including 12 crew members. The flight would be just over 10 hours, an overnight crossing of the Atlantic, arriving in Paris the following morning. After departure, the aircraft would track northeast, where it would climb to an altitude of 35,000 feet. Something to keep in mind is at higher altitudes, the characteristics, specifically the stalling characteristics, of an airplane will change. Just keep this in mind for later. Another thing to consider is that during this flight, it would cross an area known as the Intertropical Convergence Zone. This is just an area where there's a bunch of unstable air and it produces some powerful storms that can be tens of thousands of feet high. Storm avoidance is a routine part of these transatlantic operations. Minor course deviations are not unusual. So, from an operational standpoint, nothing about this mission stood out as unusual. It was a modern aircraft and an experienced crew. But just over 3 hours after departure, the nature of the flight would change completely. At 2:10, the autopilot disconnected. France Flight 447 was operated by three pilots. It consisted of one captain and two first officers. This was typical for long-haul flights. The captain of this flight was Captain Marc Dubois, an experienced airline captain with over 10,000 flight hours, and he had around 6,000 in Airbus aircraft. Dubois had spent many years flying long-haul routes for Air France, and he was the pilot in command of this flight. The pilot in command has the final authority of the flight. Also on board was First Officer David Robert. Robert had around 6,500 flight hours with 4,000 in Airbus aircraft. He had joined Air France several years earlier and had substantial experience flying wide-body aircraft on these international routes. The third pilot was First Officer Pierre-Cedric Monin. Monin had accumulated around 2,900 total flight hours and had about 800 hours on the A330. Now that we understand a little more about the crew, let's discuss the aircraft in depth. Flight 447 was operated by an Airbus A330-203, a long-range twin-engine wide-body designed for intercontinental operations. The aircraft is part of the Airbus's fly-by-wire family, which basically means the pilot puts inputs in and they're not directly connected to the flight control surfaces, but they are connected through a flight computer. So basically, when the pilot would make an input, the computer would compute this input, which would then command the aircraft elevator, ailerons, rudder, and even spoilers. These computers constantly analyze data from dozens of sensors across the aircraft in order to maintain stability and protect the aircraft from exceeding its aerodynamic limits. In normal operations, this system allows the aircraft to fly with a high degree of precision and automation. But like any automated system, its performance depends entirely on the accuracy of the information it receives. And one of the most important pieces of information for any aircraft is airspeed. To understand how the aircraft measures airspeed, we need to look at the pedostatic system. This system is responsible for providing the aircraft with three critical pieces of information: your airspeed, your altitude, and your vertical speed. It does this by measuring air pressure. On the outside of the aircraft, there are small probes that are called pedotubes. The pedotubes face directly into the airflow and measure ram air pressure, the pressure created as the aircraft moves through the air. In addition to pedotubes, the aircraft also has static ports, which measure the surrounding atmospheric pressure. By comparing the pressure measured in the pedotubes with the ambient pressure measured by the static ports, the aircraft can determine how fast it is moving through an air mass. This value becomes the aircraft's indicated airspeed. One key detail about the A330 is it consisted of Thales AA pitot probes, which had previously shown susceptibility to icing. If these probes become obstructed, the airspeed information sent to the aircraft's computers can become unreliable. On the Airbus A330, this data is not sent directly to the pilot's instruments alone. Instead, it is processed by several onboard computers known as Air Data Inertial Reference Units. These computers combine pedostatic data with internal navigation information to calculate the aircraft's airspeed, altitude, attitude, and vertical speed. This information is then distributed to multiple systems throughout the aircraft, including the primary flight displays, the autopilot, the flight management system, and the flight control computers. In other words, many of the aircraft's automated functions rely on accurate airspeed data. Under normal conditions, the Airbus flight control system operates in what is known as normal law. In this mode, the aircraft includes several built-in flight envelope protections designed to prevent the aircraft from exceeding certain aerodynamic limits. For example, the system includes protections that prevent the aircraft from exceeding its maximum bank angle, overspeeding, or entering a stall. If the pilot attempts to command the aircraft beyond these limits, the flight control computers automatically limit the control inputs. This makes it extremely difficult to stall the aircraft under normal operating conditions. But these protections depend on reliable airspeed data. If the aircraft's computers can no longer trust the airspeed information being received from the pedostatic system, the flight control computers may revert to a degraded control mode. When that happens, some of the automated protections can be lost. Cruise flight at high altitude introduces its own aerodynamic challenges. At altitudes around 35,000 feet, the air density is significantly lower than it is closer to the ground. This is because the air is thinner, and because of this, the aircraft must fly at a higher true airspeed in order to generate the lift required to remain airborne. However, the aircraft must also remain below its maximum Mach number, which represents the speed at which compressibility effects begin to become significant. As a result, aircraft at high altitude operate within a relatively narrow band of safe speeds. On one side of this band is the low-speed aerodynamic stall. On the other side is the high-speed Mach limit. This region is referred to as coffin corner, where the margin between stall speed and overspeed becomes smaller. Under normal conditions, the aircraft's computers can help manage these limits. But if airspeed data becomes unreliable, the situation can become significantly more complicated for the flight crew. Now that we understand a little bit more about the crew and the aircraft, let's dive into what happened. For the first several hours of flight, everything proceeded normally. Air France Flight 447 climbed to its assigned cruise altitude of flight level 350, or that's around 35,000 feet. At this altitude, the aircraft was cruising roughly at Mach 0.82, just a typical speed for long-haul operations. The aircraft was operating under autopilot, with the autothrust system managing engine power automatically. In the cockpit, the crew monitored systems, weather radar, and communications with air traffic control as the aircraft continued north across the Atlantic. Ahead of the aircraft lay the Intertropical Convergence Zone, often referred to as the ITCZ. This region near the equator is known for its intense convective activity. Towering cumulonimbus clouds can rise to extreme altitudes, producing heavy precipitation, turbulence, and powerful updrafts. Transatlantic crews cross this region routinely, typically navigating between storm cells using onboard weather radar. On this night, it was no different. Flight 447 adjusted their route slightly to avoid some of the larger storm systems, but the environment had remained turbulent. Around this time, Captain Marc Dubois left the cockpit to take a scheduled rest break. Long-haul flights commonly include relief periods for pilots so that fatigue can be managed during overnight operations. With Marc Dubois resting, The aircraft continued under the supervision of the other two pilots. As the aircraft approached the most active weather band, turbulence increased. Ice crystals and supercooled water droplets were present within the storm systems. These conditions are challenging at high altitudes, and they would soon begin affecting one of the aircraft's most critical sensors. Shortly after 2:10 UTC, ice crystals began to accumulate on the aircraft's pitot probes. As discussed earlier, these probes are responsible for measuring total air pressure, which is used to calculate the aircraft's airspeed. As the probes became obstructed, the pressure readings they provided began to fluctuate. The aircraft's computers detected that the airspeed data being received from the pitot tubes was no longer consistent. In Airbus aircraft, when airspeed information becomes unreliable, the flight control system automatically disconnects certain automated functions. Around this time, the autopilot disconnected, along with the auto thrust system. The aircraft's flight control system reverted from normal law to alternate law. With this change, some of the Airbus's built-in protections were no longer available. The pilots now had direct responsibility for controlling the aircraft's pitch and thrust. Startled by the sudden autopilot disconnect and inconsistent airspeed indications, the flying pilot, First Officer Pierre, reacted by pulling back on the side stick. This caused the aircraft's nose to pitch up. At the same time, engine thrust increased. The aircraft began climbing. As the aircraft climbed, its angle of attack increased. Angle of attack refers to the angle between the aircraft's wing and the airflow. When this angle becomes too great, the airflow over the wing can separate. When that happens, the wing stops producing sufficient lift. This condition is known as a stall. Within seconds, the aircraft's stall warning system activated. An alarm sounded in the cockpit, and it sounded like this. Stalled. At this point, the aircraft had stalled. Instead of lowering the nose to reduce the angle of attack, the pilot held this nose up attitude. The cockpit environment quickly became confusing. Airspeed indications were fluctuating, warnings were disappearing and reappearing, and the aircraft's behavior did not match what the pilots expected. Because the airspeed data had become unreliable, some warning systems were activating and deactivating. This added further confusion to an already complex situation. As the aircraft continued to pitch upward, the stall deepened. Despite descending rapidly, the aircraft had remained in a nose-high attitude. Eventually, this led to a deep stalled condition. In this state, the aircraft is descending through the air while the wings remain stalled. At times, the aircraft was descending at over 10,000 feet per minute, yet the pilots continued attempting to climb. Hearing the escalating warnings and confusion in the cockpit, Captain Dues returned to the flight deck. By the time he had arrived, the aircraft had already lost significant altitude. The situation was now extremely difficult to diagnose. For the next several minutes, the aircraft remained in a fully developed stall. Despite descending from 35,000 feet, the pilots never recognized the stall condition clearly enough to perform the correct recovery procedure. Throughout the descent, the aircraft maintained a pitch attitude of roughly 15 degrees nose up. This prevented the wings from regaining lift. At 2:14 UTC, after just 4 minutes of uncontrolled descent, Air France Flight 447 impacted the Atlantic Ocean, and sadly nobody survived. In the immediate aftermath of the crash, search and rescue operations began across a vast area of the Atlantic Ocean. The aircraft had disappeared in one of the most remote regions of the world, hundreds of miles from the nearest coastline. Initially, investigators faced a major challenge. They did not know exactly what had happened, and without the aircraft's flight recorders, the cause of the accident would remain uncertain. Within days, debris from the aircraft began appearing on the ocean's surface. Pieces of the fuselage, cabin components, personal belongings. These fragments confirmed that the aircraft had broken apart on impact with the water, but they did not reveal why. The investigation was led by the BEA, basically the French Aviation Accident Investigation Agency. Their task was to reconstruct what had happened using the limited evidence available. But one critical piece of evidence was still missing: the aircraft's flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder. The crash had occurred in water nearly 4,000 meters deep. Finding the flight recorders in such conditions would prove extremely difficult. Initial searches were unsuccessful. Months passed, then years passed. For a time, it appeared possible that the full story of Flight 447 might never be known. In 2011, nearly 2 years after the accident, a new deep-sea search located the wreckage on the ocean floor. Using remotely operated vehicles, investigators were able to recover both the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder. For the first time, investigators could reconstruct the final minutes of flight in detail. The investigation determined that the chain of events began with temporary obstruction of the aircraft's pitot probes. Ice crystals within the storm system had interfered with the probe's ability to measure airspeed accurately. As a result, the aircraft's computer detected inconsistent airspeed data. This triggered the automatic disconnection of the autopilot. When the autopilot disconnected, the aircraft's flight control system reverted from normal law to alternate law. In this mode, certain flight envelope protections, including the full stall protection, were no longer available. The aircraft was still flyable, but the pilots had a greater direct responsibility for managing the aircraft's pitch and airspeed. And this all comes down to human factors. Investigators concluded that the flight crew did not fully recognize that the aircraft had entered a stall. Instead, the control inputs continued to command a nose-up attitude. This maintained a high angle of attack, preventing the wings from regaining lift. The result was a prolonged descent while the aircraft remained stalled. At high altitude, stall behavior can be difficult to recognize. The cues that pilots often rely on at lower altitudes, such as buffeting or clear aerodynamic feedback, may be weaker. Additionally, the inconsistent airspeed indications created an environment of uncertainty in the cockpit. They had multiple alerts, fluctuating instruments, and the aircraft behaving in unexpected ways. Basically, they didn't know what to believe. One of the key findings of the investigation involved pilot training. At the time of the accident, airline pilots rarely practiced high-altitude stall recovery in simulators. Training programs focused primarily on stall scenarios occurring during takeoff or landing, but stalls at cruise altitude behave differently, and recovery procedures may require immediate and decisive nose-down inputs. Following the accident, training programs around the world began emphasizing recognition and recovery from high-altitude stalls. The pitot probe was also redesigned. The probes installed on Flight 447 were susceptible to icing from high-altitude ice crystals. In response, Airbus and airliners began replacing these probes with improved models that were more resistant to ice accumulation. The accident also sparked renewed discussion about the relationship between pilots and automation. Modern aircraft rely heavily on automated systems. These systems provide tremendous safety benefits, but they also require pilots to remain prepared to take manual control when automation becomes unreliable. Following the accident, many airlines expanded training programs focused on manual aircraft handling at high altitude. In aviation, accidents often lead to important improvements. Air France Flight 447 was no exception. The lessons learned from this event influenced changes in pilot training, aircraft sensor design, and understanding of high-altitude aerodynamics. Each of these changes help reduce the likelihood of similar accidents occurring in the future. Air travel today remains one of the most safest forms of transportation, But that safety is built on learning from the past. Every investigation, every report, every lesson learned contributes to making the next flight safer than the last. The story of Air France Flight 447 is a reminder that aviation safety evolves through understanding, and that the lessons written in accident reports continue shaping the future of flight. Thank you all for watching. I hope there was something you could take away from this accident and the lessons learned from it. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to leave a comment and consider subscribing for more aviation analysis in the future.